Hello everybody, welcome to the Evangelist Nick Garrett channel. I've got something fun for us today. Something I'm sure we've all wondered about and we've read about and seen quotes about through movies and books. What were the religious affiliations of all U.S. presidents or the denominations that they belonged to? There's been speculation about some of them, like Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and William Howard Taft, that they were atheists. And it was reported during election campaigns, though, some that were particularly heinous and dirty. So those types of accusations can't really be trusted. Other presidents, such as Jimmy Carter, used their faith as a big platform on which they ran. Almost all the presidents can be characterized as Christians, at least by upbringing, although some were unaffiliated and later joined a denomination. Protestants are certainly the predominant denomination, with early presidents being Episcopalian and Presbyterian. There was a single Roman Catholic, and some had no religious affiliation to speak of. Every president from James Garfield, the 20th, who in fact at some point had considered joining a pastorate himself, can be known with certainty. The ones before, it's hard to differentiate between religion, Christianity used as part of a public persona, and ones that were authentic to their daily lives. Every president from George Washington to John Quincy Adams can be assigned membership to Anglican and Episcopalian, even though they weren't necessarily truly affiliated there. The inner beliefs of the presidents are much more difficult to establish than church membership. There's a concept of Deism among the Founding Fathers, for example. It was a religious philosophy in common practice during colonial times. Some of the Founding Fathers, most notably Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, was an explicit proponent of it, along with Benjamin Franklin. Thomas Jefferson became a deist later in life, and Washington, James Madison, James Monroe, and John Tyler are often considered as having deistic beliefs. Interestingly, there were elements of some presidents' religious beliefs that were Unitarian, or more specifically, non-Trinitarian. Unitarians fell outside the Trinitarian concept of Christianity. John Quincy Adams, for example, left great details about his beliefs. William Howard Taft said, "I'm very interested in the spread of Christian civilization, but to go into a dogmatic discussion of creed, I will not do, whether I am defeated or not." Two presidents were Quakers, Herbert Hoover and Richard Nixon. The only other president with any association to non-Trinitarian belief was Dwight Eisenhower, who was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, but later, after becoming president, was baptized as a Presbyterian, the only president to have such a ceremony in the White House himself. The only president really labeled as non-religious in general was James Monroe, the 5th U.S. president. So now I want to give you details on each of the religious affiliations of the United States presidents. George Washington is listed as Episcopalian and deist. He was also a Freemason. Many believe he was high up, but I believe it is accurate historically that he was only an entered apprentice, which is the first of the 3 lodge-level degrees. 13 or 33, it's 13 of the United States presidents have been Freemasons. John Adams was a Unitarian. They were members of the state-supported Congregationalist Church in New England. Thomas Jefferson's religious affiliation is not listed, but later in life he became a deist. James Madison was an Episcopalian and a deist also. James Monroe is listed as an Episcopalian by his upbringing, but he wasn't really one. John Quincy Adams was a non-Trinity Unitarian. Andrew Jackson, the 7th president, was a Presbyterian, and Martin Van Buren, the 8th United States president, was Dutch Reformed. The 9th president, William Henry Harrison, is listed as Episcopalian. He was a vestryman at Christ Episcopal Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. John Tyler, the 10th U.S. president, also listed Episcopalian. Although he was affiliated with them, he didn't take a denominational approach with God. James Polk, the 11th president of the United States, is the first one to show up among our U.S. presidents as a Methodist. He came from a Presbyterian upbringing, but he wasn't baptized as a child. He was actually baptized on his deathbed. He had a conversion experience at a Methodist camp meeting when he was in his 30s. The 12th president, Zachary Taylor, was an Episcopalian. He was raised as one, and he married a devout Episcopalian, but he never became a full member of the church. The 13th president, Millard Fillmore, also a non-Trinity Unitarian. The 14th president, Franklin Pierce, is Episcopalian, and the 15th president, James Buchanan, was a Presbyterian. He supported various churches throughout his life, and he joined a Presbyterian church during his presidency. Abraham Lincoln's an interesting character. No denomination is listed as part of his upbringing, but we look at him as a man who had great respect for God, quoted scriptures often. Many believed Lincoln was a deist. He did attend a Presbyterian church in Washington, D.C. John Remsburg, president of the American Secular Union, argued against claims that Lincoln had converted to Christianity at some point in his life. After his assassination, Miss Lincoln said, Mr. Lincoln had no hope and no faith in the usual acceptance of these words. His lifelong friend and executor, Judge David Davis, affirmed the same. He had no faith in the Christian sense of the term. His biographer, Colonel Layman, intimately acquainted him with him in Illinois and with him during all the years he lived in Washington, says, never in all that time did he let fall from his lips or his pen an expression which remotely implied the slightest faith in Jesus as the Son of God and the Savior of men. Now, he clearly did believe in God of some form, and maybe that's where the deism comes from. The 17th president, Andrew Johnson, had no formal affiliation. He accompanied Methodist services with his wife, but he didn't go to church himself. He sometimes went to a Catholic church service, remarking favorably that there was no reserved seating like there was in some of the other churches. Ulysses Grant, the 18th president, was a Methodist. Rutherford Hayes was a Protestant, but an unspecified denomination. The 20th president, James Garfield, belonged to a denomination called the Disciples of Christ. He was baptized at the age of 18, and through his 20s, he actually preached and held revival meetings, though he was never formally a minister within the church. 21st president, Chester Arthur, is an Episcopalian. His father was actually a Baptist preacher. I'm sure that made Daddy angry. Upon his wife's death in 1880, he commissioned a memorial window for the south transept of St. John's Lafayette Square, visible from the White House. The 22nd and 24th president, non-consecutive, Grover Cleveland, was a Presbyterian. The 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison, Reformed Presbyterian. And the 25th president, William McKinley, was a Methodist. Theodore Roosevelt, 26, was Dutch Reformed. William Howard Taft was listed as a Unitarian, but for much of his life did not hold to particularly Christian beliefs, but he did have a belief in God. He did not believe in the Trinity. The 28th president, Woodrow Wilson, was a Presbyterian. 29, Warren G. Harding. We have the first Baptist president there. Number 30, Calvin Coolidge, was a Congregationalist. And the 31st president, Herbert Hoover, was a Quaker. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the 32nd president, was an Episcopalian. Harry Truman, the 33rd president, was a Baptist. And Dwight Eisenhower, the 34th president, as you remember, was raised Jehovah's Witness, but converted to Presbyterianism later in his life. John Kennedy was a Roman Catholic, and he was the only Roman Catholic to this point to serve in the U.S. presidency. At the time, it was a big deal. Roman Catholicism was not popular at the time for a number of reasons. And people did not know that they could trust, whether they could trust a Roman Catholic or not. The country at the time was predominantly still Protestant in belief. The 36th president, Lyndon Johnson, was a disciple of Christ. Richard Nixon, 37th president, was a Quaker. Jerry Ford, 38th president, was an Episcopalian. 39th president Jimmy Carter was a Baptist. Ronald Reagan was a Presbyterian. George H.W. Bush was an Episcopalian. Bill Clinton was a Baptist. George W. Bush was a Methodist. Barack Obama's listed as unspecified Protestant, yet he was raised in countries where he attended Muslim schools. For example, he lived for a while with his stepfather Sotoro in Indonesia, and it is said in the book by, forgive me, the name escapes me, but an early biography written on him, David Marinus, a writer for the Washington Post, that he was certainly influenced by his Muslim upbringing in those countries. He resigned from the Trinity United Church of Christ in the light of a controversy that came out on TV during his run for presidency with a pastor named Jeremiah Wright. He attended several different churches as president, and for the most part, he attended Methodist churches. The 45th president, Donald Trump, is a Presbyterian. He attended Reformed Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan. That's where he married his first wife, Ivana, in 1977. And he goes to Lakeside Presbyterian in West Palm Beach, Florida. He's also had a long association with Paula White, an evangelical and Pentecostal minister who is right now in the news, a great deal of controversy and criticism among other Christians and other denominations across the board for a number of reasons, ranging from the idea that women should not be preaching all the way to the fact that some suggest she's teaching false doctrine. So this is an interesting list here to suggest, first and foremost, that every U.S. president we've had has claimed some type of Christian affiliation. Some have been more devoted than others. Some have attended as a means of political benefit, and some have had a serious personal faith that's driven the work that they did. If you want to find out more, there's some great books on the subject called The Faiths of Our Founders. And I'm going to add this to a playlist we have about the Founding Fathers and what religion they were, where it goes into more detail of a biographical nature on this subject. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this. May God bless you, and may your work today bear fruit.